All righty. And then we will go ahead and get this done.
Hey, everybody, welcome.
Okay. Let me do this right here because I got my different screen pulled up. All righty. I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Please bear with us. All righty. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Walisha Wilson. I am the founder of NewLife-Second Chance Outreach. I know several of you may have seen in different areas and platforms and different hats that I wear, whether I'm at Southern Center for Human Rights or I'm doing some work with All of Us or None. But at this point in time, I am here to host an event for my nonprofit, which is NewLife-Second Chance Outreach. We are a nonprofit organization here in Atlanta, but we work with individuals throughout Georgia who are impacted by an arrest or a conviction or something on their criminal background that creates some type of issue with them obtaining employment and access to other community resources. The purpose of this event is to address an important issue. Yeah, I'm gonna take this off because that was just my notes. An important issue on the way the public has been taught to talk about incarceration and the people who have been affected by it, formerly incarcerated people. Using this type of language only exacerbates and perpetuates the dehumanizing nature of the criminal legal system. Studies show that using dehumanizing language alters the way we view and treat people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, from the way we refer to them, deny them jobs and housing, as well as isolate and exclude them from social and civic engagements and processes. By humanizing people, we give them dignity and humanity by emphasizing them as human beings, not by what they may or may not have done. When we emphasize their humanity instead of their past mistakes, we see them as Paul or Eric and not as inmate, parolee, or felon, because that is not who they are. Now, before we get into our speaker introductions, I'd like you all to just bear with me and close your eyes and think of a time where there was an absolutely worst and most embarrassing or taboo thing that you have done in your life. Whether you were 12 years old, whether you were 20 years old, whatever, pick the most absolute and taboo time or something that you did that was completely embarrassing, that might have isolated you from your family or whatever it is. Pick that one moment. Now think of that one moment think of that one moment as being something that was used to shame you for the rest of your life and to keep you from gaining access to the things that you need to be successful, such as a job, an education, public assistance, the right to vote, housing, and 43,000 other collateral consequences that having a felony conviction can get you because you served time. That's not right. So for instance, if you had a baby at 13 or 14, that's not something that you should be carrying or being shamed for the rest of your life. And it's the same thing with wearing the scarlet letter F. That is not something that should keep people for the rest of their life being able to attain what they need. Now, before, again, using humanizing language is not only critical for everyday people, but it is especially important that it be used to cover justice involved people in the media. Why? Because according to a Marshall Project article, when journalists write about private citizens, your article is often among the first results of an internet search on their name. That stigma and material consequences of incarceration are so deep that what seems like a basic descriptor to journalists becomes a permanent, potentially life-altering label for the people that it impacts. Over 75% of people who are in jail or held there have not even been convicted of a crime. So technically speaking, these people are considered to be inmates because of their physical location. But the term inmate in itself is dangerously precise because it is widely perceived as an assignment of guilt. Journalism is a discipline of clarity, And if a segment of your audience reads a particular word as a slur or a suggestion of guilt, that word becomes an unnecessary distraction from your actual work, which is getting the point across for the story. Given the systematic racism and classism embedded in the US criminal justice system, language about incarceration places an undue burden on people of color and poor people. So lastly, I ask you, what added value does having a headline that says felon or ex-con saves child wandering in high traffic highway, or convict sought for questioning in rape, or inmate receives college degree? Why point out the fact that the man or woman who saved a child's life had a felony, or that a man or woman who received a college degree was currently incarcerated? Or that the fact that a suspect is sought in a crime. Not only do using these terms do not add value to the purpose and the point that you're trying to get across, but it perpetuates fear, and it makes it sound as if doing what anybody else does in life, especially if it's something good, is not expected of people who are just as involved or impacted, as if we are an anomaly or a pink unicorn. We can do good things too. So saying that a man who saves a child's life would have been just as good as a headline. You did not have to point out the fact that he had served time. We are human, just as anyone else is, and we deserve to be treated as human and not defined by our circumstances, and we respectfully ask that you refer to us and cover us in the media as such. So now we're going to go ahead with our speaker introductions. I'll introduce you to them in the way that they're going to speak and present. We'll first start with Dr. Maxine Bryant. Nationally and internationally, Dr. Bryant participants have used her to describe her as a dynamic presenter. From topics as non-threatening as customer service to topics as delicate as race relations, diversity, and inclusion, Dr. Bryant has repeatedly captured the hearts and minds of many audiences. She is a very able orator who is well-versed in a variety of topics and has presented and or developed workshops, lectures, and keynote addresses to a diverse audiences across America, in the Grill, Jamaica, West Indies, Cairo, Egypt, and Ghana, Africa. Dr. Bryant holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Ball State University, a Master of Arts degree from Saginaw Valley State University, and a Doctorate of Philosophy and Human Services from Walden University. All of her degrees have a concentration in criminal justice corrections. In 1998, Dr. Bryant established the Bryant Educational Seminars and Training Program, BEST, a training consulting firm known for offering dynamic and life-changing workshops that focus on culture and diversity and the successful reintegration of released individuals. She has written and presented transitional jobs for newly released individuals, the role of the Black church in successful reintegration of justice-impacted people, disenfranchisement of persons with criminal histories, the impact of unaddressed childhood trauma and barriers to successful reintegration. And in 2021, she began an internet radio show called Criminalized by Color, which is designed to educate, inform, and enlighten audiences about the impact of institutionalized racism in multiple systems, particularly but not exclusively the criminal justice. That same year, she became a monthly columnist for the Savannah Morning News. Her column appears in the arts and culture section of the Sunday paper and focuses on Black culture, particularly in coastal Georgia. Dr. Bryant is currently an assistant professor of criminal justice, the director of Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Center, and the director of the Africana Center at Georgia Southern University. She is a published author of 3 books and honored in many ways over the years. As a facilitator and minister, Dr. Bryant draws upon God-given communication talents and gifts and combines an award-winning presentation style to inspire and instruct, to educate and enlighten, to plan, promote, and problem solve, and to embrace audiences in an exhilarating experience. That is Dr. Maxine Bryant. Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant, for joining us. We'll now talk about Paige Dukes. Dukes is my coworker at the Southern Center for Human Rights, and she is an awesome human being. She joined the Southern Center for Human Rights as a communications intern in 2019 while finishing her dual BA in mass communications and philosophy and religion at Piedmont College. In May of 2020, Paige joined the Southern Center staff as a communications associate. During her time at Piedmont College, Paige served as a social justice fellow and received the James Cox Award for Community Journalism. She was released from prison in May of 2017 after serving a mandatory 10-year sentence. She is a founding member of the Athens Reentry Coalition Collaborative, which is a support group for released people. She interned at the Marshall Project in 2018, where she wrote and edited stories for the Life Inside series. She is active in raising awareness about the effects of incarceration, the need for restoration of rights, and accurate media representation for incarcerated people, and amplifying the voices of incarcerated women. Thank you both so much for joining us at New Life Second Chance Outreach for this very important conversation on the importance of using humanizing language when referring to individuals to end stigma. So we will turn it over to Dr. Bryant, who has an awesome presentation. After Dr. Bryant, we'll have about 5 minutes for anybody who would like to ask any any questions of Dr. Bryant about her presentation. Then we will go into Paige's presentation and do about a 5-minute Q&A for anybody who has any direct questions for Paige's presentation. And then we'll have maybe a 5 or 10-minute little discussion on some issues. And then we'll open the floor for any discussions until we end the event. All righty. Thank you all so much for joining us. Dr. Bryant, you have the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Ms. Wilson, for this opportunity. Good afternoon to all of you who are on. I'm excited to be your presenter this afternoon. I want to start with something that's a little bit different from my last presentation that Ms. Wilson heard. Some of you may have heard this before, but I think it's very relevant. It's a poem. I like to write poetry. I didn't write this, though. It's a poem called The Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. Now, we all know that an autobiography is our story. And I want you to think then for a moment about our country's story, the story of the United States of America, particularly as it relates to people with criminal histories. Chapter number 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I don't see it. I don't know it's there. I fall in. It's not my fault. I don't know where I am, and it takes me a long time to get out. Chapter number 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I don't see it. I fall in. I don't know where I am. It still takes me a long time to get out, and it's still not my fault. Chapter number 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it. I know it's there. I fall in again. It's a habit. I know where I am. It is my fault, and I get out immediately. Chapter number 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter number 5, I walk down a different street. I open up with that because in the United States of America, we have walked down the same street over and over again as it relates to our relationship with people with criminal histories, with people who have been just as impacted. We don't know what to do with them. We don't know what to call them. Back in the 80s, there was a paper that came out that said nothing works. Throw away the key, lock them up. And then in the 90s, we entered into the war on drugs, and we were introduced to the super predator. We were introduced to the criminal who's going to hurt us right around the corner, lurking at every corner. And we didn't know whether to educate, to rehabilitate, to throw away the key, or what. And so now here we are in 2022, and we're still wrestling with some of the same problems and issues and challenges as it relates to people with criminal histories. And I use that criminal histories because, as it's already been alluded to, a person can be arrested and let go, but still have to suffer through some of the same collateral consequences because he or she has a record. And so I want to introduce you then to my presentation. I like the name of this. Hopefully you can see my screen page. Can you see? Okay, thank you. I am not your convict. Words really do matter. And it is important, as has already been said, that we use humanizing language so that we can end the stigma associated with being involved or impacted by our criminal justice system. So there are three primary objectives that I have for today. I want us to consider the crime numbers that are presented through media that are often used to incite fear and apprehension. I want us to understand the impact of words that are used by media and by lay people. And finally, I want us to experience a paradigm shift. So this is a rather provocative picture. I came across this quote many, many years ago. Statistics are like the bikini. What they reveal is suggestive. What they conceal is vital. So why do I use this picture when I'm talking about statistics and crime numbers? Because we need to look beyond the numbers that are presented to us via media, and particularly in politicians also. And we need to understand what's the meaning behind the number. Who's the audience? What's trying to be, what are they attempting to say? What message are they attempting to convey? And who are they talking to? Remember, we can sway statistics any way we want. And so I'm encouraging you then to be informed consumers of media as you take a look at what you see on the television and what you read on the in the newspapers. So let's talk crime for a moment. There are two basic types of crime. So we have conventional crime, which is also noted as street crime. Your violent crime, your property crime, your drug offenses, that's your murder, your aggravated assault, your theft, all of robbery, all of that is included in those crimes. We also have white collar crime, which is more often called corporate crime or environmental crime or what have you. Now, here's what I want you to remember. In actuality, there's more corporate crime or white collar crime that goes on, and there's a larger impact, both economically and in terms of human toll, the toll on us as humans. So white collar crime endangers employees through unsafe working conditions. They injure consumers because of dangerous products. It causes pollution problems that impacts the ecology. But we very seldom hear about them. And when we do, it's like a big splash for a period of time, unless there's a trial to follow, and then we hear about it for a while, and then it dissipates. It goes away. We don't hear about it in the news. What we hear about instead is the robbery, the murder, the kidnapping, all of those type of things. It's in our faces every day. So when you then think about how you view a criminal or the image that comes to your mind, all too often, implicit bias seeps in, and what people see in their minds is often a Black male between the ages of 16 and 35 who has violently attacked someone or taken something from someone, right? And media is not like a standalone entity of itself with a mind of its own. It consists then of people, and the implicit bias of people seeps into media and what they report and how they report. No matter how objective or accurate they really are, right? How does that happen? It happens like this. People who run media or who contribute to the reporting determine which topics and events are covered and even what is covered when a topical event is covered. It determines that implicit bias, that thinking of the reporting person determines what gets emphasized and what gets neglected in coverage about what is considered to be newsworthy incidents and newsworthy topics. So in our country, we have primarily two major types of media that people pay attention to. First, there's the newspaper. Now, newspaper offers an abundance of crime news coverage because they have the space to do so. They can run a sequence of stories. They can place stories on the front page, or they can give it a little bit of attention at the bottom, in the corner, in the back, right? Now, despite the fact that property crimes are much more common, what we hear or what we read then in media, in our newspapers, is often about violent crimes. They're covered much more frequently, particularly in our local newspapers. Then we have television. Now, interestingly enough, live broadcast techniques and consultants often recommend to our television news stations how to improve those ratings with those attention-grabbing news coverage about crime, about the criminal, right? And so what we've seen over the years is a shift then from public affairs journalism and of stories that focus on politics and issues that are relevant to the public and government, to a shift where we're emphasizing live breaking news about the scene of the crime. We got to break in right now. Something's going on right now. And what happens then is that it begins to feed into our minds, the consumer, that, oh my goodness, crime is everywhere. Crime is on the rise. Oh my goodness. And it incites fear. So then what's the role of media in creating the perception of crime? There are three primary roles that I want to cover in this short presentation. First, we need to remember, I can't emphasize this enough, that media content, what we see, what we hear, what is told to us, is shaped by economic and marketing considerations all too often. Want more newspapers read? Headline: the latest crime that has happened. Right? It's going to get the attention. People want to read about it. Want more viewers on television? Breaking news about the most recent horrendous, horrific crime. Because it feeds that need for excitement, that need to know, what's going on, right? And so that's much more exciting than talking about some of the white collar crimes that we may hear. So, for example, I used to run a federal halfway house in Saginaw, Michigan, and it was for people who've been convicted of federal crimes, and they were white collar crimes, right? And many of the people that lived in the halfway house committed like fraud, selling prescriptions. I had one lady, for example, who was caught, she was convicted of selling prescription drugs via the phone, and the fact that she did it via the phone lines made it a federal crime. That didn't make headlines. That was kind of a boring crime, right? But what if she had robbed somebody in the front of a drugstore and hit them over the head and knocked them down and almost killed them and stabbed them and ran off with an unknown amount of money, right? That would have made headlines. But not an old lady using the phone to sell prescription drugs. Number two, the extent and style of news stories about crime are adjusted to meet the perceived viewer demand and advertising strategies. So how they do what they do, how they share the news, where they place the news at the beginning of a newscast, near the middle, near the end, the front of the newspaper, on the back, all of that is strategic. And as consumers, we need to recognize that so that we can be informed consumers. Number three, this market-driven treatment of how crime is reported, how crime is told in the media, potentially skews public perception of the amount of crime and the types of crime. As I said before, there's much more harm and much more occurrence of white collar crime. But we don't hear about that. That's not an in-your-face kind of thing that's presented in media. So what's the result of the skewed representation and telling of the story of crime? Back in the 1990s, the crime rate was actually falling. That was actually during the time of the war on drugs when that was introduced, right? But we didn't perceive it that way. Actually, from 1993 to 1996, the national murder rate dropped by 20%. However, our major news outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, increased their stories about murders by 721%. Really? So, of course, we, the consumer, were thinking murders are happening all the time, everywhere. I'm going to be next, right? It incited fear. Even now, that was then. Let's talk about now. From 2019 to 2020, crime, your street crimes that I mentioned earlier, the conventional crimes, rape, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, auto theft, all of that, it actually fell by 3.3%. But that's not the rhetoric that we hear. It's not the rhetoric that we read. What we see, what we hear, is that violent crime is on the rise, particularly in the wake of all the talk about police reform and defunding the police. Oh my goodness, if you do that, I know you've seen some of the commercials. If you do that, you're going to call the cops and nobody's going to be answering because they've been defunded. As consumers, we've got to make sure we are informed by taking a look at all of the information that is available to us. Now, if you remember a moment ago, I mentioned how the words that we see in media and that we hear kind of creates an image. And too often that image is of a young Black male who's committed a heinous crime. So here are some of these words: convict, ex-con. Who wants to be associated with a convict or ex-con? Felon, ex-felon. Someone who has broken the law. They have broken the law. They've been incarcerated. They deserve just to be cast away. Criminal. I don't know how many of you have seen the documentary by Ava DuVernay called The 13th. And there's a segment in it where she talks about how the word criminal, 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 criminal was plastered over the news, particularly during the war on drugs. That was seared into our brain. Ex-offender, offender. And don't forget one that's not on the slide, but I thought about it afterwards. Remember the super predator? They were going to come and get us. They were looking around every corner. Hillary Clinton, and I love Hillary, but Hillary Clinton even had a news conference about the super predator and how they were going to get us. They were Black young youth who were perceived to have almost supernatural strength and ability, right, to come and get us, to commit a crime against us. I like what Ms. Wilson alluded to in her opening statement. And what she said reminded me of something that I heard years ago. Do you all remember the Polaroid camera? That's long before we had cell phones. We had the Polaroid camera, and you would snap a picture and you'd have to shake the film, then you peel it, and the result was a standstill picture caught in a moment of time of that person. Now, today, we have cell phones and we can edit, we can make ourselves look good, we can use a filter, we can even add hair, we can erase the scene in back of us, erase a person if we don't want somebody to know we were with that person. We can do all kinds of things, right? The Polaroid, you didn't have a choice. What you saw is what you got. It was the Polaroid capture of a moment. And what we do too often with people with criminal histories is that we hold them hostage to a Polaroid picture of a moment in their lives, and we accuse them. We continue to punish them for the rest of their lives, particularly when we use words like convict or felon or criminal or offender or ex-offender, right? We hold them hostage. And as Ms. Wilson said earlier, not only is it not fair, it's not right. So here's the impact of our words. Now you got to remember that mass media are gatekeepers of words that we use in our society and how we view the people and the things that they report about. So what happens then oftentimes is that the media tells us that crime is on the rise. And so that increases public concern. And then crime then becomes the primary criteria with which we measure what's going on in our world. And then there's an emphasized need for policy. And the politicians hear that, they run on law and order. They run on being hard on crime. And so that market-driven treatment of crime and the words that media uses skews then public opinion, resulting in an increased support for punitive policies, mandatory minimums, longer sentences, and treating juveniles as adults. And the result of all of that is that the United States leads the world in incarceration. We incarcerate more than anybody in the world. And even though we're doing some things now to try to turn that around, we still have far too many people not only incarcerated, but who are suffering with those collateral consequences that Ms. Wilson talked about earlier. Some of you might remember, I think it was in 1988, when Michael Dukakis was running against the first George Bush. And he was, one of the things on his platform was to allow people who were in prison to go home on furloughs, right, for weekends. And there was a guy named Willie Horton who did that. He went home on a furlough on a weekend. And while he was out, he raped someone and he stabbed her boyfriend. Heinous crime, horrible. Media's pounced on that so much, and so Dukakis then, who advocated for humane treatment of people in prison, was slashed, lost the election, perhaps due to some other things, but definitely due to media's handling, if you will, of that horrific incident. And out of that, and out of the war on drugs and all of that, came some policies that proved detrimental really for a lot of people, and definitely in terms of how we as a people view people with criminal histories. So then what do we do then? How do we treat them? What do we call them? What's the answer? Here's where I want to invite you to experience a paradigm shift. I want you to first of all recognize that people who have been impacted by the justice system are people first. They're not convicts first. They're not criminals first. They're not ex-cons first. As Ms. Wilson said, that describes what they did, describes the behavior, but who they are people first. I'm originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I moved down here to Savannah, Georgia about 10 years ago. And I can remember I had in class, and at the time I was the only African-American in the criminal justice faculty here at that time it was Armstrong State University. And I had a young man, a Caucasian man in my class, and he referred to me as being a colored person. Okay, whew. I had to take a step back for a moment, right? We prefer people of color, not colored people. That took us back, whoa, about 40 years, my goodness. Right? People first. Who are these people first? They're people who are justice impacted. They have been impacted one way or another by the justice system, either by being arrested, not yet convicted, or being convicted. Either way, they have been impacted by the justice system. They can be justice involved. That's another term. I work with a lot of people with criminal histories here in the Savannah area, and I ask them, what do you prefer to be called? And their response was justice impacted or justice involved. Now, I want to say here too, with justice impacted, it's not just the people who have been impacted directly, but also their families, their loved ones, the people who support them are also impacted by the justice system. I had one young man who wanted to live with his mother, but his mother, upon being released from prison, but his mother lived in public housing. She wanted her son with her so she could help provide for him, care for him, nurture him, guide him. She couldn't have a son with her rather, because of those rules, those policies, those collateral consequences that Ms. Wilson spoke of earlier. So what? Now what? What's the conclusion of it all? Here's what I say. Justice scholars and other professionals and lay people who are not involved in teaching or advocating or what have you, we all need to take an active role in framing the justice stories and framing the narrative. We know, just as people who are descendants from African people who were brought here to the United States, we know that if we don't tell our narratives, other people tell our narratives and they leave some stuff out, or they change some stuff, or they reduce some stuff, they minimize some stuff. We need to take charge of the accurate narrative for justice impacted people. We need to do our own research and tell accurate truth. Be informed media consumers. Use people first knowledge and language. Use people first language. When we're posting on social media, we can do that. That's a way of educating the public. When we're having our own personal conversations, if you have a conversation with someone and they say, oh, that I read about that convict. No. Correct them. People first. In our formal conversations, when we're hosting or participating in workshops and work groups or what have you, be mindful of the language we use. Host forums like this. I want to congratulate Ms. Wilson for doing this, right? And for Paige, who you're going to hear from in a little bit. Host forums like this. Attend press conferences, ask the questions. Make sure that the numbers that are being shared are accurate and as unbiased as possible. Challenge harmful, untrue rhetoric, whether it's the skewed numbers or whether it's the language that's being used. Write editorials and op-eds. Blog. Anybody these days can start a blog to educate and heighten awareness about an issue. Use podcasts. You heard Ms. Wilson talk earlier about my podcast, Criminalized by Color. I just decided that as an educator, there are people who are not going to pay to come to my college classes. They're not going to pay the tuition to get into Georgia Southern. But I can still educate them by sharing my knowledge with them. Get involved with our election process, particularly those who are here in Georgia, particularly those people who have criminal histories in Georgia. Why? Because if you got to pay attention to what's going on right now at the government level, even with the Board of Regents in Georgia, across the board, there are efforts to change the landscape. And if it's changing in a way that we don't want it to be changed, we need to know. That means we got to pay attention and get involved. People with criminal histories, justice involved people. If you're not on paper in Georgia, you can vote. Use your vote. Pay attention to why they don't want you to vote. Research that. There's a reason behind that. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. As the screen says, I'm Dr. Maxine Bryant at Georgia Southern University. You can reach me at that number. That's my office number. I'm also on Facebook, Maxine Bryant. I'm on Twitter, Maxie B Tweets, MAXIB Tweets. I'm also on LinkedIn, Maxine Bryant. If you want to hear more about my perspectives and what I have to offer in terms of educating the public and increasing awareness, you can reach me. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Bryant. That was an awesome presentation. And also, when you get a chance, drop those social medias in the chat, as well as your contact information. I know in your bio, I read that you do a paper for the Coastal, so you can also send a link to that as well, so we can catch that. At this time, we'll have about 5 minutes if anybody had any burning questions for Dr. Bryant about her presentation or anything that she said. Also, if you would look at the chat, I have been dropping a few links to some articles about best practices for those in journalism when you're covering in media articles. So if does anybody have a question, feel free to come off mute and ask your question of Dr. Bryant. And if you could, when you do speak, and I know it's very hard, but just like a lot of words evolved, we're no longer colored, we're no longer the N word we've taken some use to saying African American. We've gotten used to calling people with developmental disabilities from the R word to now intellectually disabled. If you are going to ask a question, I ask that you try your best, and Paige is going to talk about the oops and ouch when she speaks, to not use derogatory or dehumanizing terms such as convict, criminal, prisoner, ex-con, and those words that I did drop in the chat. So do we have anybody that has a question of Dr. Bryant? We will be able to get a recording of this. It's actually live streaming on NewLife-Second Chance's Facebook page, and we will actually have a recording that we will upload onto our YouTube page later as well. And we do have a lot of awesome events that we have, talks about those barriers to challenges. If you all could go to our YouTube page and stay informed on that. A lot of our events are focused on these type of conversations about the barriers that we have as justice involved people. And I'll make sure I drop that YouTube link as well. So it looks like we don't have any questions. There's no, before we go to Paige's presentation. Don't be shamed.
I want to ask a question, Dr. Bryant. You mentioned that some of the formerly incarcerated people that you have worked with chose words like justice impacted and justice involved. I personally don't like calling the criminal legal system a justice system because I think it's very far from actual justice, and I think we're working towards getting closer to justice. So I'm just curious, like, where do you think words came from? Because a lot of times we find terminology in academic writings and things. And so I'm just curious, where did those options for people to those words come from?
So from two places, Paige, that's really a good question. At the time, I'm trying to think, I have a conference for people with criminal histories every year. It's called the When Is the Debt Paid Conference. And I always have a speaker, a national speaker who's been there and done that. I've never been incarcerated. I also have local speakers. That conference is it's a safe place for individuals to come and talk. At one of the conferences, I would say maybe 2 years ago, the question was asked. I asked the question myself and some other people, what do you want to be called? Because I was using, as I said, the term people with criminal histories. That's what we used in Indianapolis, where I came from. Their response to me was, we want to be called justice impacted and or justice involved. So that came from them. Now, where they got it from, I don't know. Also, our mayor of Savannah, Mayor Van Johnson, has a reintegration group. We have not met in a minute, so I'm not even going to tell you the name of it. It's an acronym. But at any rate, those same people told that group the same thing, that was the language they preferred for us to use.
And I appreciate that question as well, because I kind of see it to the point of right now with this whole thing of asking people what their pronouns are, you may as well follow up with that, especially if you know that they are justice involved. You know, hi, Paige, my name is Walisha. I am a formerly incarcerated person. What are your pronouns and what do you prefer to be called? Now, I personally, and I think it's a matter of public, personal opinion. I personally don't mind being called ex-offender because it means you're offender and you ex, but then actually that's not accurate because I've been exonerated since. But I just think it's, and I think for the very rare amount of people that say, oh, I don't mind being called a felon or mind being called an ex-con, I think they have not just let it sunk in a lot, as opposed to how those terms can impact them once they've gotten out. And I think once people are educated on it, and those words can actually be just as triggering as calling a person the N word or calling a person of Latino heritage the S word. Those words can be extremely triggering, because prison itself is very traumatic. A lot of people don't think, they think it's just Orange is the New Black and Wentworth up in there, folk just having a good, and it's not. It is very dangerous and it's very traumatic. And to have those words come out with you and then have it impact your daily life, where you can't get a job because you can't get this, because this is what people know you as, it is a problem. So I think asking folks what they prefer to be called is a good practice. It's a little longer, but of course, like I said, African American is a little longer than color, but it takes time, and it shows people that you respect them and you see them as a person, because everybody deserves dignity, regardless of what folks may have done or what we assume they've done. We are people, we're parents, we're brothers and sisters. And a lot of times people just don't get it when I say it. And so I tend to wear it. Y'all see this t-shirt I got on? When I go out, I wear it. And it engages the conversation that this is not who I am. It is offensive to call me a felon. I am Walisha. I'm a business owner. I'm an advocate. I'm a sister. I'm a friend. I have 2 master's degrees, some doctoral credit. That's who I am. All of this stuff, who just happens to be a formerly incarcerated person. Okay, so I think if we don't have any more questions, we will go to, is that from your t-shirt line online? Of course, that's from my business. I have my own market, my own advertising. And so we will go ahead and go on with Paige Dukes and her presentation. Paige, you should be able to share what you need. And also any people that are on this line who are formerly incarcerated, who want to connect, that's how it works. Getting around other folks who, are positive. Please do not leave, or drop me your information in the personal thing, and we can connect. But go ahead, Paige, we're listening to you and we're looking forward to your great presentation. Thank you again, Dr. Bryant. And I'm sure there are going to be some questions before we end this event. Some people are just a little shy right now.
Thank you so much, Walisha, for inviting me to talk about this. And thank you, Dr. Bryant, for a wonderful presentation. I am Paige Dukes. I'm a native Atlantan. I was born here and raised here. And I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I was 20 years old when I went to prison. I had struggled with substance abuse for a long time. And I spent all of my 20s in prison thanks to our mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which I had no idea about. I wish I had learned about that in civics class, a little bit. Criminal legal system. But that said, I don't know that any of the consequences would have changed my actions. Knowing how strung out on drugs I was really just thinking about doing whatever I had to do to get my next fix. And I was young, so I grew up in prison, and I got out almost 5 years ago. And since then, I have been working in advocacy. I now work as a communications associate for the Southern Center for Human Rights. Walisha is our client services advocate here, so she works with me at the center. And we're a nonprofit law firm. We work for dignity, equality, and justice for people impacted by criminal legal systems in the South. And we do that through the courts and the legislature, and our work in our capital and impact litigation units, where we represent people death row and represent people in class actions who are facing really torturous conditions in prisons. And we also work through our public policy unit to change laws in Georgia. And we work on issues with the Georgia Justice Reform Partnership, which is a coalition of the organizations working on criminal legal reform policy work here in Georgia. And my work at the Southern Center is storytelling work. I talk about our work and our clients and try to shift the narrative and the way that we talk about people who are in prison, the way that we think about us. And so I have come a long way. And even the way that I tell my own story, I look look back at some of the work that I did when I was an intern here at the Southern Center, and I used words like inmates because I was conditioned, just as we all are, to use this institutionalized language. And the whole time that I was in prison, I did critically about the reasons that those words exist, the reasons that I carried those. And so I've really thought a lot about myself and other people and the way that I tell our stories. And I have learned some tools in my work because I work with journalists who cover our work and who are also used to using the same terms that we have all used for years to talk about people in prison. And I want to talk about the difference between impact and intention, because we don't intend to dehumanize people, right? We shouldn't have to humanize human beings in the first place. Why do we have to do that? Because we've been stripped of our humanity and our dignity. And so I'm going to share my screen and share this tool that I learned. One campaign that we're working on at the Southern Center is a campaign to end solitary confinement in Georgia. And I was at a round table with people in other Southern states who are working on solitary confinement. And I learned this invaluable tool from a woman named Natasha White, who works at Solitary No More, Virginia. And it's just ouch and oops. So now when I hear someone say inmate or offender, I say ouch out loud, because those words have literally come to cause me pain when I hear them. It makes me sick in a way that it didn't before, because I wasn't thinking critically about the way they used. And when I say something that feel like could potentially be harmful, I'll say oops. So this is just about giving ourselves and others grace. I don't want to police people's language, but I do want to ask people to think critically about the words they use and the impact that they have. I think Lucy's dropping the link to the Mourning Our Losses language policy. This is something that she and I, other currently and formerly incarcerated volunteers with the organization Mourning Our Losses, has put together. Mourning Our Losses was started at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, really as we realized that people in prisons were at extreme risk for illness and death from the COVID pandemic. And the only way to keep people safe was to decarcerate. And unfortunately, very few states have taken any meaningful measures towards decarceration. But Mourning Our Losses was started as a space for the disenfranchised grief of people who have family members and friends who are in prison, who are dying from COVID behind bars. And now Mourning Our Losses is expanding mission to all people who are dying in prisons. And this language policy is not about just replacing words with other terms, right? A lot of people ask me, like, what should I call them then? Like, what terminology should I use? And I think people first really is the answer, because we should just call people people. If words are used to other me and dehumanize me, like the easiest way to restore my dignity and my humanity is to just call me a person first. So people who are formerly incarcerated, people with a criminal conviction, this comes from the people first movement with people with disabilities. So you can never go wrong by using person first language. And so that's usually what I suggest. But I really love what Walisha was saying about asking people, because there are a lot of formerly incarcerated people who do say that they have reclaimed the word felon. And I reserve the right to reclaim that word if I decide to at some point. But I also, Walisha, what and letting it sink in what the intention behind these words are and the unintended consequences of continuing to use them. See if I can go to my next slide. So this is a quote from Eddie Ellis's letter to our friends. Eddie Ellis worked with the Center for New Leadership, and this letter was written in 2005. Just want your attention. This is not a new movement. This movement for language justice has been going on for a long time and has been led by formerly incarcerated people for decades. And it's a straightforward, simple letter asking people who work in the media and people who talk about us anywhere, call us people. Because the way that we regard each other really impacts the way that we treat each other. I was having a conversation with another formerly incarcerated person just earlier today, and he a convict, and that led to a conversation about what that word means in prison. And I remember that there were old timers who had been locked up for decades who felt that that word didn't affect more a badge of honor than inmate, or and that they chose convict instead. And he said, yes, that's exactly what it meant. It was a term of respect, and it meant a person was upstanding in their community. And I totally understand, because I have been there, but people who haven't been there, who don't have that experience, that word has a very different connotation. And we have to think about, especially when we're working in the media and telling stories about people in prison, like, what does that word mean to people who have no idea what it's like to be in prison? And for most people, they don't, because the way that the system is designed, people in prison are out of sight and out of mind to hear from them themselves. And first person representation is really the only accurate representation. And, you know, where do your, I'll ask you who are here, like, where do your ideas about who is in prison come from? You know, do we get to see people? Do we get to see their faces or hear their voices or hear them tell their own stories? Very rare, right? When I was in prison, a story came out in the AJ me, and a friend, Bill Rankin, who has covered courts in Georgia for 30 years, came and visited me and interviewed me. And I feel like that access was so rare. There's so few opportunities that journalists have to actually go into a prison and interview someone and quote them directly. And so that was a really awesome experience for me. He was able to, run his story by me, that I was able to have some input in the way that he described me and told my story, and I was able to be quoted directly. But that's rare. Most people get their quotes from the police or from the prison administration, from DAs. Very rare that we actually hear people and hear their stories in their own words. And so I hope that we can begin to change that. But I also got a sense of how my story could be impactful. This story was about mandatory minimum sentencing, and it gave me an idea of, how our individual stories can lead to impact laws and policies that are really responsible for our mass incarceration problem. And another thing that I just want us to keep in mind is like why these are the words we use in the first place. I'm sharing this. It is a picture that I took of a sign that's outside a prison. And it very explicitly shows that our laws encode these words to be othering. We say it shall be unlawful for any person or inmate. We are directly saying the person who is in prison, person, they are an inmate. And this is very similar to the way that our laws encoded racism, right? Systemic racism, the ways that we disenfranchise Black people and now disenfranchise people who have criminal convictions. I am more and more aware as I do this work and I move in these spaces in courts and legislature and criminal legal systems that I am impacted by a system that was not designed for me. And all of the barriers that I face in reentry, they've been designed to create a class of people who can't vote, who can't run for office, people who are relegated to the lower rungs of our society. And so even us who are talking about ourselves and our loved ones, our chosen family inside, when we are differentiating between ourselves and the guards, like, why do we have to create a different lexicon to talk about ourselves when we're all human beings? And I mentioned my friend Bill. These are conversations I've had with him over and over, and he's been working in this industry for so long, and he knows the courts probably better than most journalists do and knows how to talk about these things. But it's very much ingrained in him, this traditional way of talking about people in prison. So I try to have these conversations one person at a time, one reporter at a time, and it's really up to all of us to change the way that we talk about people in prison, the same way that we've changed the way that we talk about people of color in this country. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it looks like there's some cool stuff happening in the chat. I also dropped a link earlier to a study called Words Matter about the need for using destigmatizing language. And I'm going to try and go back and find that so I can drop that too, so you guys will have it as a resource. But I'm going to stop talking for a second and see any questions.
Okay, well, thank you so very much, Paige. Does anybody have any questions from Paige and about her presentation? Please feel free to take yourself off mute and ask your question.
I also want to say it's more than just like the individual labels that we put on people. There's also like the violent versus non-violent. You know, I was convicted of one of the quote unquote 7 deadly sins. And so if you look at my rap sheet, you know, you would definitely think that I was a violent person, but I'm not a violent person. I have, you know, it has been a long time since, you know, the crime that I committed that put me in prison when I was 20 years old. And so these labels do follow us. And when we talk about, you know, changing laws and policies, we have to be very careful about not creating this dichotomy between quote unquote nonviolent versus violent people, because those descriptors don't actually accurately describe the people that that bear them.
And when and to piggyback on what you were saying about that is, you know, you could be riding in your car with someone who happens to have a gun, but you could also be charged with that same charge, but you're just a passenger, but yet you have a gun charge, which now makes you you now have a violent felony on your record. So what it is people have to understand that in one traffic stop, you could literally get 10 different charges piled up on you at one time. So a lot of it is perception. And again, a lot of it is for profit. And a lot of it is, again, to perpetuate and instill fear in people, to make it seem that a person who has a violent charge is more of a threat of safety to community than a person with a nonviolent charge. White collar charges are considered nonviolent, stealing somebody's identity. But do you know how many people a year probably commit suicide after somebody has stolen their identity, has caused them to go into bankruptcy? To me, that's not a nonviolent charge. You have caused harm to somebody in a very different kind of way, as opposed to a person who sold some drugs but was given a life sentence. So we need to really be careful as how we're stigmatizing people and the words that we're using to separate people. To me, it's no different in colorism, with dark-skinned Black people separating themselves from light-skinned Black people, or, you know, because you're from Ecuador and you're from Nicaragua, you're a different kind of Latin. All this kind of stuff is just ways to separate people and to make people feel that some folks are less of a citizen than other folks. And that's not the case. And I think when we put it in and say, you know, and it just really bothered me. I've never seen that sign. I think even when I was locked up, I don't think I've ever noticed that sign. But to put it that way, to say persons or people or inmate, make it seem like we're not people. We are people. People who are in there who are getting shanked and getting jumped on, that's somebody's baby. That is somebody's son. That is somebody. And whether you know it or not, there are folks who are 15, 16 years old sitting in adult prisons right now, probably because they stole a radio out of somebody's car. That is not, and to be to be placed in those type of situations, to get out, and now because you have been labeled as a violent person, you can't get housing, you can't get a job. How do we expect anybody to be able to pay tax? I mean, you can't get mad at anybody that's kicking in your door if every job they go to, that is what they're looking at, because that's their perception. And I think with the role that the media plays in it is no different than we have these individuals who are arrested. You have 4 or 5 white guys who rape a young lady at school, but when they carry them out or they're coming from court, they're not in handcuffs, they're in their suits. and they may show their high school prom pictures. But if it's black guys, black boys, they're in handcuffs, they're in jumpsuits, and they're showing mugshots. And again, if you have a person that's been closed off and that's ignorant, the first thing they see from the media's perception is black boys are more dangerous than white boys. And it's no different than when you're saying in your language. And I personally respect journalists who try to use the words or don't automatically say ex-con saves child from drowning or felon does it. It's no need. It's no different than you saying a woman got robbed. You don't point out the fact that she was a black woman got robbed or a fat woman got robbed. Why? Because it is not important to the meat of your article. And therefore, I would really like to hear from people on here, especially if you're a journalist, if any of the information you're receiving, you have found it, you've heard it before, or you're finding it challenging, or what can we do as people, especially those of us who are formerly incarcerated, what can we do to support you in the way you cover us? Even if it means you got an article and you may say, hey, Walisha Page or anybody that you feel, what do you think about this article? I mean, I'd rather you all do that than to just throw something out there just to get a headline and to perpetuate fear. I really would like to hear from some folks who are in the media, whether it's print, whether it's news, that's on the line, who have changed the way you cover justice involved people in the media, or you want to, but you're finding challenges, or maybe you're getting some resistance from your editors. I really would like to hear from you all if you are on the line, because it is something that does need to change. And whether you know it or not, you all, the way you bring media, some folks don't even watch TV no more. That's all they watch is the news. And I think the way you put it out there definitely could improve society. And there could be a time when we could end stigmas with your help. So I'm going to shut up, and I really would like to hear from some people. We don't want to be the only three people talking.
I have a comment.
All right, we hear you, Mr. Yancey. Go ahead with your comment.
I'm not in the media.
You're
Lawyer.
a little low. Are you able to turn your, usually it's above the 9, 6 or 7 key. You'll see the little volume button. You can press that key.
How about that?
That's a little bit better.
All right. Yes, I'm James. Yes, I'm a lawyer, and I think there's a story in the book of Judges. I think is instructive. The guy named Jephthah was going out to battle for Israel. He said if he came back victorious, he was going to sacrifice the first person out of his house, not forgetting who was in his house, including his child. His child came out, and he knew because he had made that vow, he had to follow through with his vow, which means he had to kill his child. Now, the point of the story is that when you say something, you need to think about what you say before you say it, because words are powerful. Words have images. And he learned the very hard way of what he said just by being flippant, or as I call it, careless words, just because you heard somebody else say it, or and so forth, you just said it. So be very careful. And the second thing I learned when I was in school that I had never thought about, we used to have an organization called the Black American Law Students Association. Well, at our school, we had Black students that weren't from America. Black students from South America, from the Caribbean, from other places, and felt that they had been excluded just by the name of the organization because they were not from America. And so I don't use the term Black America just because I don't know what Black person I'm around that's from somewhere else who I may be excluded. Because like Malcolm X said, he says they don't lynch you because you're in the South, it's because you're Black. And many persons of color face the same type of problem, no matter where you're from. And so I didn't want to have a limiting, limiting a word. I wanted to make sure it was inclusive of everybody.
Can I jump in and say something that I want to reiterate? I think what you just said, Attorney Yancey, was right on point. I want us also to remember that not only are the words important that we use to describe a person, but even the process by which people leave prison and reintegrate back into society. I decided to use the word reintegration instead of reentry. With reentry, people who are leaving prison are given $25, $50 on a bus pass and told to go get it right, abide by the laws, and do the best you can. The onus then is on them, and there's no expectation of help or assistance from the community. However, if I use the word reintegration, to be fully reintegrated into society, it takes more than me as an individual. That means society then has some onus, some accountability, some responsibility to help with housing, with laws that prevent me from operating in full citizenship, from getting a job, from all of those collateral consequences that we talk about. If we want people to be successful when they are released from incarceration, it requires us as a community joining in and coming alongside them. One of my mottos is, when they win, we win, right? And without us as a community, they cannot win. And then we become a part of the problem instead of the community. So I just wanted us to even think about the language we use to describe the process with which one reintegrates back into society, and the role that society has, you and me, others, have in helping them to be successful in their reintegration efforts.
Exactly. Because 94% will come back home. It's not maybe. 94% of folks who are currently incarcerated will return home. And they will be your neighbor. Their kids will go to school with your kids. They're going to want to go to church where you go to church. So we should want folks to be successful to get out. Otherwise, there's need of complaining when they kick it in your doors and they're doing stuff, because we can't expect anybody to make a living when you can't get a job, can't go to school, can't get a barbering certificate, can't get food stamps, can't do that. And yeah, up until 2016, you couldn't even get food stamps in Georgia if you had a drug charge. So how do you get somebody out of prison? I didn't even get my $25 card, Department of Community Corrections. So I would like my $25, please. I didn't even get a $25 or a bus pass. But you get somebody, you put them, and Lord knows if they've been 16 or 17, now they've gotten out 30 years later. That means they probably don't know how to use microwave. They don't know how to use cell phone. Now we're in this virtual world. They don't know nothing about a debit card. They don't know anything about paying a bill because they've never paid a bill as an adult. But we expect you to get out, stay out of trouble. We expect you to, and we still got to pay taxes, but we can't vote now. So we ain't even gonna talk about that no representation without taxation part of it. But you want these people to succeed, to be able to pay fines, fees, restitution, but they can't get a job, can't get housing. Sometimes not having a housing can affect you getting a job. No too many people can't sleep good at night when you ain't got a job. And if you got a job, you can't sleep too, you can't go to work good in the morning when you just slept outside on the, under a tree. So, we just want to make sure that it's that old village. It's not just about it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to help other folks who are in need. And when people are getting out without IDs, without anything, it takes a village. So the question is not when people are going to come home, it's how you want them to come or how you want them to return home when they're living next door to you. And I'd rather somebody who's going to live next door to me, who's going to work, be productive. They're going to do what they need to do. They're going to school and they're doing what they can do to be a productive citizen, as opposed to saying, well, Alicia just got her a new TV. Let's go over there and take it. Because people are going to get what they need to survive, and people are going to get what they need to do to take care of themselves and their children. And I do believe it is society's responsibility. And part of that is changing the way we refer to them. All right, Mr. Burrow, you have a question? Who you want to direct it to?
Well, first of all, I want to say, Walisa, and I feel, I know Walisa, and I feel like I can call you by your first name, but to Dr. Bryant and Ms. Dukes, I want to thank you for your contribution and for raising this thoughtful topic and raising our awareness. It seems to me, and I'm directing this to all the panelists, it seems to me that we know that change comes from both the inside and the outside. And what we really have to work to push for is more people who have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system on the inside, making decisions in the positions of judges and prosecutors and law enforcement officers and in people who run correctional systems, having more people at the table when decisions are being made. For example, whoever wrote up this law that made a distinction between people and those people who were incarcerated or inmates, I think it is the way it was written, they missed it. They missed the mark. And I have to think that part of the reason they missed the mark is because they haven't sat in the shoes of someone who's been directly impacted. So I want to know from the panelists how you feel about the idea that we should push at every significant leadership position within the criminal legal system, that we should have people, the idea that we should have people who have been directly impacted sitting at the table, helping to make those decisions.
Thank you.
And I'm
Mr.
gonna
Ellis.
go on mute now. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And yes, I think the answer is yes. We need to pull up chairs at all of the tables where people are having conversations about us, right? We need to be on the boardrooms and the newsrooms and, you know, at the writers table and on research boards, and yes, and public service positions. You know, that's one of the barriers to re-entry or reintegration is like, I can't run for office, I can't serve on a jury, and surely I have the kind of a lot of people who are on juries have with the criminal legal system. A lot of people who are making laws don't have about the actual consequences of those laws. And I know that there is at least one on this call who's directly impacted. And so I think that does take us empowering ourselves. That means that we have not internalized the priority that was impressed upon us. And it takes a lot of support, I think, and community support for us to be able to empower each other and to reach back inside and give people the resources that they need to be able to advocate for themselves and to step up to those positions, even when they're told maybe that they're not allowed or that they're never going to be able to do that.
I'd like to come behind Paige and let you know that here in Savannah, and I referred to it earlier, I just had a brain thing and couldn't remember, but because we do believe that it is important for the population that we're referring to, justice impacted people with criminal histories, we believe that it's important for them to be at the table. So when the mayor convened a committee of people who are called ARCs, Advocates for Restorative Communities in Savannah, people who have been justice impacted were invited to participate, and we were divided up into various committees, but they led one of the committees, and it was important for a person with a criminal history to be on each committee in addition to the one that they led. That would lead to increased awareness, increased support, and humanizing the story. See, if I just look at Patty or Paige, I'm sorry, or Miss Wilson as an ex-offender, I'm just going to say their number, whatever their number was that they were given. But if I'm interacting with them and I see them in a position of power on a committee that the mayor put in place, then that humanizes them and it puts a face to what we might otherwise consider the issue. Also, when those of us who are here, if we have an opportunity to be in leadership or to hire people, we can put our money where our mouths are. There was a period of time in Savannah where I was the director for the End Gun Violence Initiative, which focused on gun and gangs violence in our city. I had the opportunity to hire someone to work alongside me as I was the director and I needed a coordinator. I deliberately and intentionally chose someone who had been there and done that, because he spoke a language to the very people that we were trying to touch base with that I couldn't say. I couldn't reach those people, no matter how hard I might try. right? So he was my right-hand person, and together we were able to make a difference. So if we're in a position to make choices like that when it comes to hiring individuals, let's put our money where our mouths are. And so we can act what we talked about. Our audio and our video needs to match.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant. We have a question from Lucy, but to piggyback on what you said about putting our money and where our mouths are at, that is exactly, be intentional in what you're doing. That is one of the reasons, with my absolute best and certainty, when we go out to eat, and I know a lot of people say, well, Alicia, let's go to lunch. The first thing I want to do is does that place hire formerly incarcerated folk? I am intentional of where I spend my money at. I'm not going to spend my money anywhere that won't hire people who are Black. I'm not going to spend my money anywhere that's not going to hire somebody who's disabled. I'm not going to spend my money anywhere that's not going to hire somebody that's LGBTQ. And I'm certainly not going to hire somebody that will not hire someone who's formerly incarcerated, because I am all for those people. What would I look like going somewhere to spend my money that won't even hire me because I have recently gotten out of prison? So we got to be very intentional, not only in the actions that we're doing, but when you're having those conversations and somebody says, well, let's go eat here. And you say, well, why don't we go to this place? And they say, why you don't want to go over here to Olive Garden? Why you don't go to this place? Because they don't hire folks who are just as involved. And I would like to support an employer who does hire people who are returning home to our communities. That's how you can simply have that conversation. Okay, Lucy has a question.
I just want to make a comment about what Paige and Mr. Ellis and even Dr. Bryant have been talking about. You know, we need to take opportunities to empower personhood whenever we can. I know that as a jailhouse lawyer, when I was at the prison, you know, when we were writing our briefs, we would always use our names instead of just saying defendant. At the very least, you know, I would say defendant Harold. And that was an easy practice that we could do to assert our personhood. And now as a law student, I would really encourage all the attorneys who are on this call to think about that. I know that we use defendant for the sake of judicial efficiency, but simply using a person's name is really an easy way to have a policy impact. So I would just encourage people to think about that.
All righty. Did anybody else have another question? And Burrow, your hand is up. We see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had to respond to that. And thank you for raising the notion that we should call people by name. I went through a criminal trial, and my name was well known in the community, and I was routinely called a criminal, though there, you know, I was in the trial phase with no rebuke from the judge. So, you know, this whole idea of using humanizing language, I think, is also rooted in a sense of fairness and justice. We should not be calling people criminals simply because they have been accused, particularly given the presumption of innocence. So it is the humane and just and the way that we make sure that we ensure people have dignity. And that is right. I heard someone on this call say it's right. But it is also right that we live up to the framework of our Constitution. And that is that we abide and give them the benefit of innocence, or at least of the benefit of not being seen as guilty. So thank you.
Now, follow up those comments. When I first started practicing law, still practicing law at the time in which there were prosecutors in some of these deep South Georgia counties that will call a person who had been accused Joe or Mary or Robert, like they knew them. And it sort of made them, the jury and others, think that they weren't due the respect of a Mr. or a Ms. And many times I had made an objection where you call so-and-so Mr. So-and-so, we need to call Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith, and so forth. And sometimes some of them will get upset about that. And like, they say, well, defendant. I said, I don't call any of my clients defendant. I call them Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. Learn that first began practicing law, that those are words that are limited, that they'll try to give people the idea that somehow it's the other. There's them and then there's us. And the other thing that really gets next to me is when someone gets arrested. Oh, so-and-so to rob somebody. I'm saying, they just arrested. Anybody can be arrested. The president can be arrested.
Okay.
Any human being around that's alive. Probably they try to arrest some people who done died already, just because they say they can arrest anybody and everybody. And it makes a whole lot of difference because you listen to people talk about they've already tried them and convicted them and sentenced them, and they've just been at the county jail for an hour. So it's really important for folks to just think about that, how you don't want to be conveyed in that way. You want to have the same respect every other human being has, not because they are someone who's rich or someone who got a title, because they're a human being that breathes the same air you breathe.
I love that. I love that. We have enough time for one more comment, and then we're gonna close out, and I'll drop some of the links that were back in, that's going back through there. I'm going back through those to drop those for folks who want to get them. And also, if you're on your computer, you can always save your chat if you're on your computer by going to the lower right where the little piece of paper is and the happy face. There's 3 little dots there. You can click those 3 dots and it will save your chat. And again, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And I am going to drop it, as well as it'll be on our Facebook page. Do we have any more comments? Paige, did you drop your information? Dr. Bryant, just since some people came in a little later, if you don't mind going back in there and copy and paste what you did earlier, or maybe Paige can find it to drop in there, Dr. Bryant's information, as well as Paige. She sent her stuff in. Okay. And if you all want to connect with me, of course, I'm Walisha Wilson on Facebook and on my social medias. So we didn't have any other questions. Well, I appreciate, we actually got done in time. We appreciate you all. Thank you so much who have supported us. And those of you who are formerly incarcerated, as we try to do in all of our events, we love to connect with you after an event has ended. So at this time, if you would like to leave, you are more than welcome to leave. I am going to, everybody else who's not impacted, those who are, you're more than welcome to stay on the line. Then once we'll end the recording, if you want to just connect that way, we can. But other than that, the event is over, and I really, really appreciate you. And I'm going to start dropping some of the old information that's in the chat again, just to help you all out. Thank you so much, DeWitt. You all have a great one. We're going to
Thanks, everyone, for all your contributions to that conversation.
I'm going to stop the recording.